Well, I'm showing noon, so we can, you want us to go ahead and start, Robin, now that she's on?
Yes, that would be great, Mr. President.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, welcome everybody to the City Council work session for December 17th, 2021. Today's subject will be the presentation of financial and compliance audit for the year ended June 30th, 2021. So we tend to do this at this time every year. I appreciate my colleagues joining us today. It's pretty hectic with 2 weeks to go in the year, so I know it's pretty difficult to make time in your schedule. With that, we will start off with our City Treasurer, Robin Lockman, and you'll be starting off with some introductions. Oh, I should say, as is always the practice for this work session, there will be no comments or questions taken from members of the public, but there will be comments or questions taken from members of the governing body. With that, Robin, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. President and members of the City Council. My name is Robin Lockman, and I am your City Treasurer. The city is required by state statute to undergo an audit each fiscal year by an independent certified public accounting firm. Additionally, any non-federal entity such as the city that spends more than $750,000 in federal grant funds each year is also required to have what is called a single audit. A single audit is a rigorous audit with the purpose of ensuring that the city, as the recipient of federal funds, is in compliance with the federal program's requirements on how money can be spent. In fiscal year 2021, the city expended nearly $8.3 million in federal funds through programs such as the Metropolitan Planning Organization, Transit, CARES Act, among many others. To enhance the degree of confidence in the organization's financial statements, a qualified auditor is engaged to examine these statements and give their professional opinion on whether they are fairly stated in all material respects. This in turn gives our citizens confidence in the management of their public funds. As you can imagine, the city's audit is a very time-consuming process. My department starts working with auditors in July of each year, and the audit continues until the report is issued in December. I would now like to introduce our speaker, Stephanie Pickering, who is a partner at MHP, who will be presenting the city's fiscal year audit 2021 to you. She will provide a presentation that will last approximately 30 minutes and then answer any questions you may have. And I'm also available for any questions. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you for all the hard work that you and your staff do for us each and every day. I know this is a really, really time-consuming process for you all, but you always do such a great job, so thank you. Ms. Pickering, please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen this afternoon so that you can all see a copy of the financial statements as we kind of work through that today. Robin, can you give me a thumbs up? Can you see it? Excellent. Great. Well, thank you for that introduction. There are two deliverables that we provide from our office to the city every year. The first is the audit committee report. It would look like this, the report to the Honorable Mayor and members of the City Council. And then we also provide to you the actual financial and compliance report. The audit committee report is really required by professional standards and directly addressed to those charged with governments, which is just a fancy way of saying the city council. It outlines kind of the scope of our procedures, any significant findings or other information that we might want to share with you all in your oversight of management in the city. We're going to really just discuss the high points of that letter as we walk through the financial statements today. So I'm going to make reference to that, but we're really going to focus today on the actual financial statements as we walk through. I also just want to point out these financial statements are about as final as they're going to get. It is, you see, stamped final draft here, but we're really just waiting for final signatures on the representation letter before we can issue. So these numbers aren't going to change. They are what they are as of June 30th. So we're going to start here. We issue 3 opinions within the financial statements, and these cover the city as well as the city's discretely presented component unit, the Cheyenne Downtown Development Authority. And it also includes your business type funds, the water fund and the sewer fund, which are managed by the Board of Public Utilities. So they also obtain an independent standalone audit. I saw Ashley on the call today. That information gets rolled into the financial statements for the city. The 3 opinions that we provide to you all are on, the first is our opinion on the suite of financial statements. The second is an opinion on the city's compliance with laws and regulations. And the third is the opinion on compliance with uniform guidance. And we're gonna talk about all 3 of those opinions today. The financial statement opinion begins on page 1 of the financial statements. And it looks like this. Really, the key paragraph that I want to just focus on today is this very last paragraph on page 1. And it says, in our opinion, the financial statements referred to above present fairly in all material respects the financial position of the city at June 30th, 2021. So this is an unmodified or clean opinion. As a council and as a governing body, as citizens, this is the opinion that you hope that you would receive. It's a clean opinion. It's the right direction. Everything is good. We will discuss those other 2 opinions shortly. Following the independent auditor's report begins what is called management's discussion and analysis. And this is requirement through, this is just a requirement for government accounting. And it is drafted by management and then of course audited by us, and it ties back to the actual financial statements of the city, but it does a really good job of providing that comparative look between one year and the next. So in the government financial world, you present a single year presentation. Whereas like if you were to look at a not-for-profit or maybe a for-profit financial statements that you're more familiar with, those are typically comparative. So to give the reader of the financial statements that comparative look, I would direct you to the management's discussion and analysis. Just a couple of key things here to share with you. So your statement of net position is like a balance sheet that you would be familiar with in that for-profit world, and it contains all long-term assets and long-term liabilities. So capital assets, net pension liability, your OPEB responsibility, your bonds and notes payable, all of that is reflected inside the statement of net position. In total, if you were to just kind of look at last year to this year, your total net position increased $30.8 million. If you were to kind of drill in and just look at total assets from one year to the next, there was about a 6% increase in assets, and that was offset by about 4% increase in liabilities. Your biggest driver in your statement of net position in the asset section, of course, is capital assets, and that does include both assets kind of at what you all think of as the city, as well as assets held at the Board of Public Utilities. A couple of drivers there in the increase in assets. Investments increased about $23 million this year, 18%, and capital assets increased 13 million or about 2%. If you were to take a look at the liabilities side, then unearned revenue, and I'm actually going to skip now to the actual statement of net position. It's a little bit easier to see here. Your liabilities here actually increased about $6.2 million in this unearned revenue line item here. And that is almost 100% attributable to the monies that were received by the city for the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds through the American Rescue Plan Act. So those are direct funds from the federal government that were funneled for ease, if you will, through the state of Wyoming. And those were received just prior to the end of your fiscal year, June 30th, but not yet spent. So that's kind of the revenue recognition criteria for the state with federal expenditure, or federal revenue is kind of when you're spending the money. So the state hadn't met that revenue recognition criteria yet. So all of that gets deferred and is reported as unearned revenue. And that of course is new for 2021. A couple of other increases then from last year, your net pension liability, which is related to the defined benefit plan held with the Wyoming Retirement Systems, that had a 10% increase, or about $11 million. There is a really extensive footnote that we'll talk about shortly, should you be interested in more information about the net pension liability. You did have a slight decrease this year in bonds payable. That was $6.4 million, or 11%. Again, that covers both the city as well as what you all probably think when you think of all of the loans held at the Board of Public Utilities. There is a very detailed footnote as well on bonds and notes payable, and that is found in note 7. And a really great table on page 56 that shows kind of where you sat at the beginning of the year, additions to bonds or notes payable, any kind of payoffs or deletions, and then your end of year amount. Many of you may remember that there was a bond refunding within the general fund or the city itself this year. That disclosure and that transaction is disclosed there. Finally, then, if we just look at your net position, which is what you can kind of equate to your equity, if you will, 97% of your net position sits inside net investment and capital assets. So the bulk of it is in infrastructure, buildings, equipment, those kinds of things. It is a very consistent number with last year. So I think last year, your net position invested in capital assets was 99%. This year it's 97%. So consistent from year to year that the bulk of your equity is due to those capital assets. If we shift now to your statement of activities, which you all can kind of think of as your income statement for the city, this begins here on page 12. Total revenue increased $20.5 million this year, about 14%, while your expenses in general stayed pretty flat. There was a slight 1% decrease. Probably the single largest contributor to that revenue number increasing has to do with this capital grants and contributions column here on page PDF page 21. And that's really just driven by that increased money that the city got as you kind of navigated the pandemic. In the back of the financial statements is a listing of all of the federal expenditures that the state or the city had, and that's reported on your schedule of federal expenditures. And if you were to look at that schedule, you would see a correlating increase in that federal spending, if you will. You may remember that I just said your expenditures, those stayed pretty flat for the year. So what that is telling us is that the city continued to provide a consistent level of support to citizens, run your programs. You were just paying for it through different sources of money from one year to the next. Another kind of interesting statistic that we saw was an increase of about $4 million here in the sales tax line item. And the page kind of splits funny in the PDF, but that's this $5 million number, or this $55 million number there. Last year it was right at $51 million, and this year close to $56 million in sales tax revenue. Following the statement of net position and net assets then begins what are called fund level statements. And I'm not going to really spend much time on it today. There is a slight nuance in the fund level versus the statements we talked about. These are really focused on near-term activities. So they exclude long-term assets and like capital assets, and they exclude those long-term liabilities. It's really just focused on kind of within like the year and like a 60-day period post year end. So there's a little bit of nuance, but by and large, the things that drove the increases on your statement of net position or statement of activities are going to be identical here to your fund level statements. The benefit of these is that if you were interested, you could drill down into an individual fund and look at the performance of that fund within the city, as opposed to just thinking about the city as a, one big entity. Following the fund level statements then, beginning on page, let's see, this PDF page 35, actual page 29 begins your footnotes. Management selects all accounting policies that are used by the city, and these policies really drive how the city records activity. And of course, we come in as auditors and make sure that your city treasurer's office is applying principles correctly under government accounting standards. We identified no significant accounting policies that we thought were controversial or policies that the district management had made in emerging areas where there was a lack of authoritative guidance. So by and large, if you were to compare note 1 this year to last year, it would be very consistent. We also identified no unusual transactions during our audit. There was one new standard that was adopted this year, and that is GASB 84, and it has to do with fiduciary activities. As a result of that adoption, the Treasurer's Office identified a couple of funds that were previously reported in the general fund that really met the new definition of a custodial fund. And so those were moved out of the general fund and put into their own custodial fund, fiduciary fund. There is a set of financial statements in kind of that fund level section that I was telling you about. If you want a little bit more information on this kind of new adoption of the standard, you can find that on page 17 or in note 17. It's at the very end of your footnotes. A couple of other footnotes that we would just like to call your attention to as a city council. The first is the net pension liability. And as I had previously mentioned, there's a very substantial footnote on this, and it is in note 8. We get there. The city participates, city's employees, if you will, participate in 4 different plans that are managed by the Wyoming retirement systems. The bulk of your employees are probably in the public employee pension plan, which covers both City of Cheyenne as well as BOPU employees. Paid Fire A, Paid Fire B, and then your law enforcement employees are in the law enforcement pension plan. Also, the city has an OPEB or other post-employment benefit plan. You can find some good information on that in note 15, which begins on page 69. The net pension liability is really driven by Wyoming retirement systems. And of course, determining that liability involves a significant amount of estimation. And that estimation process can kind of change from year to year. Your city treasurer's office is really not involved in kind of estimating the net pension liability. All of that is done by Wyoming Retirement Systems, their board, and in conjunction with their actuaries. What the city does is they record their reported proportionate share of that liability each year. So of course, that net pension liability can go up or down depending on how the investments at the Wyoming Retirement Systems performed, any changes that that board made in assumptions, the number of people participating in the pension plan from year to year. All of that can drive the city's proportionate share and ultimately the net pension liability number that gets reported. The city OPEB is similar in that it also requires an estimation process, but the city is much more involved, if you will, in kind of that process. It's also a single member plan, which means only the city participates in it, as opposed to the public, the Wyoming Retirement Systems plans, which are called multiple employer plans. Again, your OPEB, the estimation process is really driven by actuary assumptions and participant levels within that, that plan. As part of our audit procedures, we evaluated the city's estimation process for both of those liabilities and found them to be reasonable. The third and final significant estimate that that we have identified within the financial statements is related to the landfill. Government GAAP requires an estimate be booked for the future closure of that landfill when it gets full. How do you close that down? How do you make reclamation efforts to kind of clean that up after you're no longer using the landfill? In our review of that estimation process, we also found that to be reasonable as well. Lots of other really great footnotes, but I'm not going to spend any more time today on those. All of them were very consistent in terms of the content from year to year, just kind of updated for current year activities. So I recommend that you do spend some time just kind of flipping through those notes, become a little bit maybe more familiar, if you will, with some of that activity. But in terms of time today, we're going to skip to the next two opinions that we provide to you all. The first one here on PDF page 110 or actual page 101 is compliance with government auditing standards, which really focuses on the city and the city's compliance with various laws and regulations. For example, state statutes have several requirements, like making sure your investment policy is within the parameters set through state statute, that your cash is properly collateralized in case of loss. So those are the kinds of compliance requirements that we look at every year. We also look at your general internal controls over the financial statement process, and if we had any concerns, that would be reported through this opinion. We found no internal control issues and no compliance violations, which were required to be reported through this opinion. You may remember a year ago, there was a material weakness in this internal control opinion from last year, and that had to do with the Board of Public Utilities. And that team really should be commended for the significant amount of hard work that they put in at the Board of Public Utilities. There was no internal control findings reported at their level this year, which of course then doesn't roll up to yours. So again, that team just put in a tremendous amount of work, and we were very pleased with that audit this year. Following this opinion is your compliance on uniform guidance. So Robin explained kind of the rigorous single audit requirements. We are required to audit a certain percentage of the city's financial expenditures every year. And there's kind of a lengthy calculation process that kind of we have to go through as auditors to identify which programs that we look at. But this year we audited 3 programs. We audited the Federal Transit Cluster, the Highway Planning and Construction Cluster, and we also audited the Coronavirus Relief Fund this year. Through those audits, we identified no internal control issues or compliance violations that we would be required to report to you all. So those 2 opinions are unmodified and clean, just like your financial statement opinion was at the beginning of the presentation. I had also mentioned your schedule of federal expenditures. So I'm just going to go back a couple of pages. Should you be interested in all of the different federal programs that the city operates, beginning on PDF page 106 is your schedule of expenditures of federal awards. It's detailed out by federal assistance listing number, and of course then reports the total expenditures that you all had during the fiscal year here. Finally, I'm going to go ahead and, if I can figure out how to do it. I'm terrible at stopping the sharing process. Let's see. Well, I'll finish my presentation and then I'll stop sharing. In conclusion, just a very clean audit this year. We had a few audit adjustments, or a few adjustments to the trial balances that were presented after we started field work, and we did identify a couple of audit adjustments during our audit. Those are reported to you all in the representation letter that will be attached to the audit committee letter, but by and large, they were relatively minor items. There was also one uncorrected misstatement that we also report to you through that representation letter. And it was actually related to some items in the water and sewer funds. Again, those are not material to the financial statements, and we felt like that did not modify our opinion. We encountered no disagreements with management, nor did we have any significant difficulties in dealing with management during the audit. And finally, we were aware of no instances where management disagreed with our opinions, any conclusions we had, nor were we aware of any instances where they attempted to obtain a second opinion or opinion shop, if you will. By and large, we just really enjoy our time with the city. Robin and her team, and then Ashley and her team at the board, are consummate professionals. Between the start of the BOCU audit, which begins really in probably the May timeframe, and then into the beginning of the city's audit in July through today, we work with those teams quite significantly. We ask a lot of questions. We ask for a lot of support. Both teams are professional. They provide us with everything that we need timely, and they are just a pleasure to work with. So publicly, we really just appreciate our relationship with them, and just how responsive they are to our teams while we're in the field. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions from the city council members present today, if you have any.
Thank you, Ms. Pickering. Are there any questions or comments for Ms. Pickering? None? Well, I appreciate the report, Ms. Pickering, and we couldn't agree more about the professionalism of Robin and her staff. We're glad you agree with us. And you know, I'm not an accountant, but I know that no findings on internal controls are good, because I'm working on internal controls in my day job. So I know that that's a good thing. And as Robin gives us the monthly reports, it's nice to see our sales tax revenue showing the increase that it has. I'll ask one more time if there are any questions or comments from the governing body. And I guess hearing none, again, we appreciate your time, Ms. Pickering, and the efforts on your staff. And it's always nice to close out the year with good news like this. So much appreciated. Have a good Christmas, and we'll see you back here this time next year.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you again, Robin. You and your staff should be commended.
Thank you very much.
With that, and no questions or no other business, this work session is adjourned, and I hope everybody has a great Christmas holiday next week. Thank you.